Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing as well as can be in the current situation. Unfortunately, I can't be there in person, but I'm very grateful for ECHA arranging this online webinar so that I can speak to you a little bit about my work. Thank you, Bjorn, for the introduction, and thank you, Katri, and everyone else for all your help in making this possible. As Bjorn mentioned, I wanted to speak a little bit about the work that I do largely within the human rights arena of the UN, and how some of this work can intersect, and does intersect actually, with the work that ECHA and other European agencies, the Commission, the member states are doing on toxic chemicals, and also how the great work that the EU has been doing on chemicals and wastes is really pushing the agenda forward in terms of what we consider to be a human rights-based approach to toxic chemicals and wastes. So as special rapporteurs, we're asked to do a number of different things. And one of the things that I was told when I first took up my functions in 2014 was that part of our responsibility is to make the invisible visible, to give people a voice within national or international arenas that otherwise are often invisible, unheard. And this, I think, has a special meaning within the context of toxic chemicals. As many of us know, much of our exposures are invisible in the air we breathe, the water we drink, the consumer products we use, so on and so forth. But in addition to the invisibility of the threats, there's also the invisibility of the issue within the international treaties on human rights. I refer to it as an invisible thread, that what we have within the human rights norms and standards, the rights and duties that are contained in these treaties is incredibly on point when it comes to toxic chemicals, pollution, protection of the environment at large. But it's invisible. It's something that we have had to articulate. But when we look at the principles of equality, human dignity, when we look at the various human rights like life, health, safe and healthy work, the principle of accountability, justice, and effective remedy, it doesn't take much to see the incredible relevance of these principles and rights to the work that many are doing on toxic chemicals and wastes. The UN's mandate on toxics was actually first developed as a mandate on toxic waste. It was created in 1995 by the then Commission on Human Rights, and it was driven in large part by a sense of low and middle income countries that the international treaties, the environmental treaties that were being developed on toxic waste were essentially institutionalizing the exploitation of their lands and their people by continuing to permit, in large part, the export of waste to their countries. And so a number of countries, driven in large part by the Africans, the African group, created this mandate in 1995 to help illustrate that the issue of toxic waste is a human rights issue. Initially, this was met with considerable resistance, especially by wealthier countries, but slowly it has truly gained acceptance, I would say, within the Human Rights Council. And in 2011, the mandate was expanded to cover the full life cycle of hazardous substances and wastes. So now the title of the mandate, if you look on online, you'll see that it's actually much longer than human rights and toxics. It's the human rights implications of the environmentally sound management of hazardous substances and wastes. So you can understand why I reduced it to toxics. So the mandate is quite broad. It covers all hazardous substances. It's not defined within the resolution establishing it. And it covers all countries, any business industry that is implicated, and it applies to everyone. It isn't limited to those, to a particular vulnerable group, unlike some mandates. Essentially, what I've been asked to do is to report to the Human Rights Council on a regular basis about what I am seeing and hearing from affected communities around the world, what I am gleaning from conversations with states, with businesses, and to present annual reports describing the state of affairs. In the course of my work, I have investigated, I think, probably over 200 cases at this point. And I wanted to maybe just touch upon a few themes that run through many of these cases that I've been working on. One of those themes is, with probably of little surprise to those of you listening, the issues of poverty and race when it comes to toxic chemicals in our environment. Arguably, this was part of the issue in creating the mandate in the mid-90s. The picture that you see before you is a case that I've been working on actually for a number of years now. And interestingly, while most of my cases involve business enterprises, this is a case that doesn't involve businesses directly. It's actually a case involving the United Nations. In the late 90s, during the Kosovo conflict, the UN had housed a number of Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian families whose houses had been burnt in what was intended to be temporary camps that were constructed on a toxic wasteland. And this site on which the camps were constructed were contaminated with lead and other toxic chemicals. Predominantly, those that were housed there were children and women of reproductive age. There were about 600. Half of that figure were children, and unfortunately, tragically, they remained there for over 10 years, up to 13 years in the case of some, and many suffered irreversible health impacts. And to this day, they have not received an effective remedy, not by the UN, not by any member states. The UN has created a trust fund, but only one country has contributed at this point, and it's not a European country. So, I mean, this is one example of the challenge that communities face in getting access to an effective remedy. And here we're talking about lead, one of the best characterized hazardous substances. And even in this case, the community is unable to get access to an effective remedy. When I took up my functions, soon thereafter, the tragic explosions in Tianjin happened. You may recall that over 150 people died and nearly 1,000 individuals were injured when a chemical warehouse exploded, which was in very close proximity to residential areas in Tianjin, China. The number of deaths were tragically predominantly workers, first responders that rushed in to to try to extinguish the fire and didn't know what was actually inside this warehouse, the chemical contents. This has many similar traits to other chemical disasters, going back to the mid-'80s with Bhopal, the Bhopal tragedy, where the community didn't know what was around there, and has inspired legislation in the US and elsewhere about emergency preparedness. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case in China, and we see disasters like this unfolding around the world. But this was one of the cases that first illustrated to me the importance of looking at the situation of workers, the right of workers to safe and healthy working conditions in the context of hazardous substances and waste. So I've been working quite a bit on trying to illustrate how this right is being violated by the incessant exposure of workers, their exploitation through their exposure. The figures from the ILO are quite shocking. One worker dies every 30 seconds from exposure to hazardous substances in the workplace. So in the course of my presentation today, 120 workers will have died. And these are largely preventable deaths. And while the deaths are shocking, even greater numbers are suffering from diseases or enduring disabilities as a result of their exposures or even their parents' exposures at work. Oftentimes, the work that I've done has been in collaboration or cooperation with other special rapporteurs. There's a special rapporteur on Indigenous peoples that I've been collaborating with over the past several years, as well as a special rapporteur on food, on water, on health, and so forth. In the context of looking at the issues of Indigenous peoples, the former special rapporteur on Indigenous peoples and I, we've been looking at a number of cases involving extractive industries, so mining companies, oil and gas, and the way in which Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent has largely been ignored or only given superficial weight in the decisions that are made in complete violation of what is contained in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But when looking at the situation confronting Indigenous peoples and their right to prior informed consent, what strikes me is that it's not the issue is not simply about extractive industries coming into their lands and leaving the waste, but it's a much larger, more systemic issue, particularly with toxic chemicals that travel long distances through wind and water, contaminating their waters, their traditional foods, and eventually their bodies with no consent whatsoever. No involvement in any decision-making process, and none of these substances are even used on their lands, on their territories. And in the Arctic, for example, countless pesticides contaminate their foods, which haven't been used in those areas at all. And finally, one other theme that I wanted to mention is the issue of children. Some of you may have been familiar with the case from the Republic of Korea, South Korea, involving humidifier sterilizers or biocides, and the tragic impact on the lives of thousands of people in Korea because an untested chemical constituent was used as an quote-unquote safe additive, a healthy additive to humidifier water tanks. It took the government 6 years to discover that these mysterious health impacts that they were seeing, these respiratory illnesses, were caused by the chemical that was being used in humidifier sterilizers. This is one of the many cases that come up involving children who are oftentimes in situations of double jeopardy or even triple jeopardy because of where they live and where their parents work. While the situation in many countries is grave, especially for the most vulnerable, one of the sources of optimism for many, I think, is what has been happening over several years within the EU. When states ask me what they could be doing, oftentimes what I point them to is what the EU has been doing. For example, on the right to information, the REACH regulation, its principle of no data, no market, is something that is without rival, and it's really driving much of the measures that we have today for prevention, for precaution around the world, not just in the EU. I've actually reported on this in my 2015 report on the right to information. In that report, I spoke about how the human right to information is more than just access. Oftentimes it's been interpreted as simply a right of access, but in fact, it's a right that people have, that their governments should compel necessary information to understand what human rights implications are, what the risks are, what the impacts are. And I think REACH has embodied this perfectly with its progressive way of compelling businesses to generate information. Unlike a lot of my colleagues working on human rights, I don't have a particular right to pin the work that I do. I can't say I'm, say, the special rapporteur on the right to food and center my work around that. So last year, one thing I did was I tried to encapsulate what the state's duties are when it comes to toxic chemicals. And what I spoke about in the General Assembly was how all the rights, especially the right to life, health, and bodily integrity, come together to create a duty on states to prevent exposure. And here, again, the EU has been an excellent example, such as with its hazard-based cutoff criteria for pesticides, biocides. This has really been an embodiment of what it means to, in my view, to take a human rights-based approach, understanding the uncertainties that we have about the hazards, the exposures, and really driving our ability to transition towards safer chemicals, safer processes, and thereby respecting and protecting and fulfilling human rights that everyone has. But just as much as the EU chemical and waste agenda has been helping to respect and protect and fulfill human rights around the world, but especially in Europe, I think that the human rights arena can help to drive chemicals and waste legislation further, including within the EU. These, in my view, these are mutually synergistic approaches. The environmental approach that's adopted within the EU and a human rights-based approach. They're not mutually exclusive, but rather they complement each other quite well. And I wanted to just maybe mention a few examples of how I've seen this play out within the human rights arena in recent years. For example, on the rights of the child, one of the more recent examples that I would point to has to do with the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, when Japan raised its acceptable levels of radiation from 1 millisievert to 20 millisieverts per year. Concerns were being raised that this wasn't grounded in science and that it presented a risk, an increased risk, especially to children who may be born and raised and live their entire lives in affected areas that had been deemed to be safe because of these higher acceptable levels. So during the Universal Periodic Review of Japan, Germany actually suggested that the government of Japan lower the levels that it considered to be acceptable or safe in terms of radiation limits. I've also seen recently that within the US Supreme Court surrounding the situation of children exposed to lead in Flint, Michigan, that arguments around the child's right to bodily integrity have been accepted by the US Supreme Court. And some of you may be interested to know that in June, it's expected that a resolution will be tabled on the rights of the child and the environment, which I hope and should have several clear references to the importance of protecting the right of the child, the rights of the child, that is, from exposure to toxic substances and wastes. In addition to the work that's been done within the human rights arena on the rights of the child, there's also the right of workers to safe and healthy working conditions. For those of you that have worked on SciCam or other international environmental agreements dealing with chemicals and wastes, you may have noticed that there has been an increase in the engagement of ILO, in the engagement of the trade unions within these processes, and I think that's a very welcome development. Also within the UN Human Rights Council, we've also seen an increase in the attention of the member states of the Human Rights Council to the issues confronted by workers, these levels of death and disease that could be prevented through stronger measures. And I was very pleased to see last year that the UN Human Rights Council has passed a resolution urging states to do more about the situation confronting workers. The toxics mandate has over the years developed 15 principles dealing with what states and businesses should be doing to better protect workers' human rights from toxic exposures. And the Human Rights Council has urged states and businesses to implement these 15 principles. In addition, the ILO has also started to increase its engagement on the right of workers to safe and healthy working conditions. Strangely, the ILO recognizes a number of human rights as being fundamental rights and principles of workers. But safe and healthy working conditions, for whatever reason, has never been part of that small group. However, last year at the International Labor Conference, the ILO has begun a process to include the right of workers to safe and healthy work as one of its fundamental rights, which will trigger a number of measures that could be taken within states to increase the levels of protection. And finally, one thing I'll say is that the right to life and a life with dignity has recently been reinterpreted or redefined by the UN Committee on Human Rights in its General Comment 36. And for those of us working on environmental protection, I think this reinterpretation is very much welcome. Its language on pollution, on the impact of environmental degradation on life and dignity is extremely clear and, in my view, extremely useful. And last year, we actually saw the UN Human Rights Committee put that language into action on a case involving pesticides in Paraguay that Caceres and others brought before the UN. when they were unable to get access to an effective remedy for contamination and incessant exposures to pesticides in their community. The UN Human Rights Committee found that this was a violation of their right to life, their right to a life with dignity. And it did not say that it was not a violation of their right to be free from cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. While they did not analyze it, they also did not exclude that this right to be free from cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment can be implicated by our exposures to toxic substances. While I'm encouraged by what is happening within the human rights arena, I mean, the sad reality is that businesses continue to exploit double standards between countries as well as within countries, oftentimes with impunity. And this is something I think that human rights has something to say about and can say something about. This figure before you is the number of deaths caused by pollution that are exported through trade to other countries. And you can see where a lot of the deaths are coming from in red and where they're going to in blue. This figure, however, is only for air pollution. It doesn't cover toxic substances like industrial chemicals and pesticides, which are also being exported to countries with lower standards of protection. This is an issue that I have raised repeatedly with states in doing country visits. When I visit a country in the EU, I have been raising this issue, and it's something that I think countries are starting to realize that this is something of a human rights concern. Thanks to the decision that was very helpful by the UN Human Rights Committee on the right to life involving pesticides, we're starting to see increased attention, increased action on trying to curtail these pesticides, industrial chemicals that are being exported to countries with weak or even non-existent standards of protection, measures for enforcement, monitoring. The situation is quite grave. So I was in Brazil in December, and there, indigenous peoples were telling me how the pesticides that are being sprayed are actually being used as chemical weapons to drive them from their lands. And so these types of concerns, have led to actually UN committees on human rights putting out recommendations that states stop importing pesticides that are banned from use within the country from which they're being exported for health or environmental reasons. And I was very pleased with the French government recently enacting a prohibition on the export of industrial chemicals and pesticides that are prohibited from use for health or environmental reasons, which should take effect fairly soon. The pesticide industry actually contested this within the courts, and the French Constitutional Court very clearly said that the human right to life supersedes the business's right to profit, and it upheld the French ban. And so this, I think, is an important precedent and something that other EU member states or even the EU as a whole could look to for inspiration to try to address the injustice of what is happening in many developing countries, which is a pandemic, what pediatricians have referred to as a silent pandemic of disease, disability, and death that is resulting from various pesticides that have long been phased out by the EU. with that, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you virtually. And a lot of the reports I mentioned, a lot of the recommendations, the resolutions are available on the websites there, as is my email address and social media. So if I can be of assistance at any point, I'm very grateful to be of service. And thank you very much. I look forward to any questions you may have.